My name is Hannah Collins, and this happened to me in late fall of 2024 when I was 24 years old. At the time, I was in my final year of nursing school and completing my clinical internship at a hospital in downtown Chicago. I almost always worked the night shift because it was the only schedule that fit around my classes, so my routine was completely different from most people's. I usually left the hospital shortly after midnight, and it took me about 20 minutes to drive back to the apartment where I lived alone. It was an old building, constructed many decades earlier with narrow hallways, thick walls, and plumbing that made noise almost constantly. The rent was relatively cheap for the area, and since I was living on a tight budget, I never seriously considered looking for another place. I only had a mixed-breed dog named Cooper, whom I had adopted as a puppy. He was extremely calm, rarely barked without a reason, and practically slept through the entire night. Because of that, I always felt a little safer coming home so late. That particular night, I was completely exhausted after a difficult shift, during which I barely had a chance to sit down for even a minute. My only plan was to take a hot shower, eat whatever I could find, and go to sleep because I had class again only a few hours later. As soon as I walked into the apartment, I did exactly what I always did. I locked the front door, checked the security chain, left my backpack on the kitchen table, and poured some dog food into Cooper's bowl. He was already waiting for me near the door, wagging his tail. The apartment was small but organized, with one bedroom, a living room connected to the kitchen, and a bathroom at the end of a short hallway. I took off my scrubs, turned on the shower, and let the water warm up while replying to a few messages on my phone. Once I stepped into the shower, the steam quickly filled the bathroom, and for the first time that day, I began to relax. That's when I heard a metallic noise coming from the wall beside the shower. It sounded like someone tapping a pipe 2 or 3 times with a tool. At first, I didn't think much of it because that building was constantly undergoing minor repairs, and plumbing noises were common. But a few seconds later, the same sound came back, this time a little louder, and from another part of the wall. I stood still, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The water was still running, but I clearly heard another series of sharp knocks followed by the slow scraping sound of metal against metal, as if someone were working on some hidden structure behind that wall. I remember feeling immediately uneasy, even though I kept trying to convince myself that it was probably just a maintenance worker doing repairs late at night. I finished my shower much faster than usual and stood in the bathroom for a few seconds, simply listening. As soon as I turned off the water, complete silence returned. The only sounds were the building's heating system occasionally popping and the distant hum of an elevator somewhere on another floor. I opened the bathroom door and found Cooper lying peacefully near the couch, completely relaxed, which made me believe I had probably overreacted because of how exhausted I was. I changed into comfortable clothes, heated up a bowl of canned soup in the microwave, and watched a few videos on my phone while I ate. It was probably around 1:30 in the morning when I remembered that I needed to take the trash to the collection room at the end of the hallway. I grabbed the bag, stepped outside, and locked the apartment behind me. The hallway was empty, illuminated only by those old fluorescent lights that gave off a dim yellowish glow. As I walked toward the trash room, I noticed something I had never seen since moving into that building. The small metal maintenance door built into the wall near the fire escape staircase was open a few inches. It was always kept locked with a padlock because it led to the building's technical corridor, where plumbing and electrical lines ran. At that moment, there was no one around. No toolbox, no maintenance cart, and no signs indicating that anyone was working. I slowly walked past the door and caught a strong smell of dust mixed with rusty metal coming from inside. For a brief moment, I thought I heard movement somewhere deep inside that narrow corridor, like the faint sound of a shoe scraping across concrete. I stopped to listen more carefully, but everything went silent again. I decided not to touch anything, threw away the trash, and returned to my apartment, convincing myself that a maintenance worker had probably just forgotten to close the door. After I went back inside, I locked everything again and looked through the peephole before turning off the lights, something I had never done before. The hallway was still completely empty. Even so, I couldn't stop thinking about that open maintenance door while brushing my teeth and getting ready for bed. I even picked up my phone to remind myself to call the building management the next morning, but then I figured it would probably be an overreaction. Before going to bed, I took Cooper out onto the apartment's small balcony for one last quick trip. It was freezing outside, and the only thing I could hear was the wind blowing between the buildings. When we came back inside, he wandered around the living room, sniffing the floor the way he did every night before following me into the bedroom. I turned off the lights just before 2 in the morning. The apartment became completely dark except for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. It took me several minutes to fall asleep because I kept thinking about the noises inside the wall and that maintenance door left open. But eventually exhaustion won. I have no idea how long I slept. I only know that I suddenly woke up without understanding why. The bedroom was still dark and completely silent. My heart was already racing before I had even fully opened my eyes, as if my body had noticed something before my mind did. That's when I realized Cooper was no longer lying beside the bed. He was standing perfectly still near the wardrobe, staring directly at the wall behind it. He wasn't barking, growling, or wagging his tail. He was simply staring at that exact spot without looking away, his ears fully perked up. While I tried to understand what was happening, I heard a soft click coming from that exact direction. I froze in bed. The click had been so quiet that if there had been any other noise in the apartment, I probably wouldn't have noticed it. I held my breath and kept watching Cooper. He remained in exactly the same position, his body rigid and his head tilted slightly to the right, as if he were following some extremely slow movement behind the wall. My first thought was that there might be a rat inside the pipes or that the plumbing was creaking because of the cold. I desperately wanted to believe that. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and turned on the screen without using the flashlight. The dim light illuminated part of the bedroom and I could still see Cooper staring at the exact same spot. Then I heard another sound. It wasn't a knock. It was the short scraping noise of metal sliding against metal, followed by an almost inaudible creak. At that moment, I turned on my phone's flashlight and pointed it toward the wardrobe. At first glance, I didn't notice anything unusual, but when I got out of bed and took 2 steps forward, I realized there was a narrow, dark gap between the wall and the side of the wardrobe. I had lived there for almost a year and had never paid attention to that area because the wardrobe almost completely covered that part of the wall. I shifted the flashlight beam a few inches and immediately felt my stomach drop. Behind the wardrobe was a narrow panel painted the same color as the wall, and it was slightly open. The opening couldn't have been more than 2 inches wide, but it was enough to show that it definitely wasn't part of the apartment's design. I was absolutely certain that panel had never been opened before. For a few seconds, I simply stood there staring without being able to think clearly. My brain was searching for a logical explanation while every instinct in my body told me to get out immediately. I took another cautious step closer and realized the panel seemed to lead into a narrow, dark technical corridor hidden inside the building's walls. I immediately remembered the metal maintenance door I had seen standing open only a few hours earlier. For the first time, I began connecting the two things. While I was trying to process what I was seeing, I heard a sound I will never forget. It came from inside that hidden space. It wasn't a voice. It was someone breathing. Very slowly. So close that it seemed to be just on the other side of the opening. Every hair on my arm stood up instantly. I took a step backward almost without realizing it, and Cooper finally began to growl, but unlike he ever had before, low, steady, and continuous. It was at that exact moment that the gap widened by a few more inches. I didn't see a hand appear or a face looking through. I only watched the panel slowly move inward into my bedroom, as if someone were pushing it with extreme care to make as little noise as possible. That was enough to erase any doubt I still had. Someone was inside that technical corridor, trying to enter my apartment without ever coming through the front door. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I grabbed Cooper's leash, which was hanging from the bedroom doorknob, and backed away without taking the flashlight off the opening. The panel stopped moving the very moment Cooper's growl became louder. The silence that followed was somehow even worse. I could hear nothing except my own breathing, and my heart pounding so hard that my chest actually hurt. I backed out of the bedroom, keeping the flashlight pointed toward that hidden space, terrified that someone would stick their head out at any second. As soon as I reached the living room, I shut the bedroom door, even though I knew a thin wooden door wouldn't stop anyone truly determined to get through. I locked the apartment's front door almost instinctively rather than logically, considering the threat clearly wasn't outside. My hands were shaking as I picked up my phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher immediately noticed how nervous I was and asked me to slow down. I explained that I believed someone was inside the wall of my apartment. Saying it out loud made me feel like I sounded completely paranoid. Even so, I told her about the open maintenance door, the hidden panel behind my wardrobe, and how it had just moved. She instructed me to stay on the line, leave the apartment if it was safe to do so, and wait for the officers somewhere well lit. I opened the apartment door very carefully and looked both ways down the hallway. It was empty. Holding tightly onto Cooper's leash, I practically ran toward the elevator, but immediately changed my mind when I realized it was stopped on another floor. There was no way I was going to stand there waiting for those metal doors to open. Instead, I headed for the fire escape. As I hurried downstairs, I heard a sound coming from the hallway on my floor. It didn't sound like someone running. It was a series of slow, controlled footsteps moving calmly across the concrete floor. I stopped for a second, hidden behind the stairwell wall, and carefully looked through the small window in the fire door. I saw only a man walking across the hallway toward the staircase at the opposite end of the building. He was wearing a dark hoodie with the hood up, work pants, and carrying something long tucked under one arm that I couldn't identify because of the poor lighting. He didn't run, didn't look back, and didn't try to hide his face. He simply kept walking until he disappeared at the far end of the hallway, exactly where the maintenance corridor door was located. A few seconds later, I heard a heavy metal door slam shut. Only then did I continue down the stairs, practically dragging Cooper behind me, unable to stop thinking that if I had woken up only a few minutes later, that man might already have been standing completely inside my bedroom. The police arrived only a few minutes later and went upstairs with me. I was still standing outside on the sidewalk when one of the officers asked me to remain there while they searched the apartment. Those 15 or 20 minutes felt much longer. When they finally called me back inside, I found the bedroom door open and the wardrobe pulled completely away from the wall. For the first time, I was able to see the entire hidden structure behind it. There really was a narrow technical corridor, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways, connecting several apartments on that floor. The panel was open, but no one was inside. The officers searched the corridor with flashlights and discovered that it led directly to the small maintenance door I had seen open earlier that night. There were fresh boot prints in the dust and several tools scattered near the entrance, but nothing identifying any maintenance worker. One of the officers commented that old buildings like that sometimes had corridors like those to make plumbing and electrical repairs easier, although they were normally kept locked. The building manager was called in during the middle of the night and looked genuinely shocked when he saw what had happened. According to him, only the maintenance crew should have had access to that area. The padlock on the metal maintenance door had been forced open, and no one could say how long it had been that way. The following morning, I packed a few clothes, took Cooper to a friend's house, and never spent another night in that apartment. A few weeks later, I was informed that the police had never managed to identify the man who had entered the technical corridor that night. They also discovered that several other tenants had reported strange noises inside the walls months earlier. But everyone had assumed it was simply the building's old plumbing. Ever since then, whenever I stay in a hotel or walk into an older apartment building, the very first thing I do is look for maintenance doors, hidden panels, and any space that could provide access inside the walls. Before that night, it had never occurred to me that someone could enter an apartment without ever touching the front door. Now I know it's possible. And honestly, what frightens me the most isn't remembering that panel slowly opening. It's thinking that if Cooper hadn't woken up first and kept staring at that wall, I might not have realized there was someone else inside my bedroom until it was far too late. Story 2. My name is Oliver Walker, and this happened to me in January of 2024 when I was 28 years old. I worked as a software developer for a company based in Denver, but I did everything remotely. Since I could work from anywhere, I decided to spend a few months in a small town in rural Colorado to save some money and get away from the hustle and bustle of the city. I found a furnished apartment in a simple 2-story building surrounded by pine trees with only a few houses nearby. The landlord mentioned that during the winter, most of the residents either traveled or spent the season in other towns, so only 4 apartments remained occupied at that time of year. To me, that sounded perfect. I needed peace and quiet to work, and I didn't mind not having neighbors around. My routine was always the same. I spent the entire day programming, took short walks in the snow whenever the weather allowed, and watched a TV series before going to bed each night. The building was unbelievably quiet. After 8 o'clock in the evening, you could barely hear doors closing, televisions, or people talking. At first, I found it strange, but I quickly got used to it. It seemed like exactly the kind of place where nothing ever happened. My apartment faced another unit directly across a narrow hallway. During my first few days there, I noticed signs that someone lived there. The doormat was always in place. Fresh footprints would occasionally appear in the snow beneath the window, and at night a faint light could sometimes be seen through the gaps in the curtains. Even so, I never once saw anyone entering or leaving that apartment. Since I worked from home, I spent almost the entire day near my living room window or close to the front door. I also went out at different times to buy coffee, go grocery shopping, or take out the trash. Even then, I never crossed paths with the person living in that unit. I figured maybe they worked overnight shifts or simply had a schedule completely opposite to mine. I didn't think much of it until I noticed something that slowly began to bother me. Every single night without exception, right after I turned off the living room lights before going to bed, a shadow would appear behind the curtain of the apartment across the hall. It never made any sudden movements. It simply remained standing there for several minutes, directly facing my front door before disappearing again. During the first few days, I tried to come up with perfectly normal explanations. I even thought the shadow might simply be someone watching television near the window or looking at their phone before going to bed. The problem was how consistently it happened. I would turn off the living room lights, start walking toward my bedroom, and only a few seconds later the silhouette would appear behind the curtain. I even began running small experiments. One night, I left only a table lamp on and sat on the couch for nearly half an hour. Nothing happened. When I finally turned off the light, I walked toward the kitchen pretending I was heading to bed, and before entering the bedroom, I quietly looked through the gap in the blinds. The shadow was already there. It was tall, completely motionless, positioned exactly where someone would be able to see my apartment door through the curtain. The strangest part was that I could never make out any facial features or details of the body. All I saw was the dark outline of a person standing there. After a few minutes, it disappeared. The following day, everything would go back to normal as if nothing had happened. I mentioned it to the landlord when he stopped by to clear the snow from the entrance of the building. He laughed and told me that the tenant across the hall was a very private man who had lived there for several years and rarely spoke to anyone. I asked whether he really still lived there because I had never seen him leave. The landlord simply replied, "Some people like living in isolation," and changed the subject. Even after that conversation, my feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. I started paying attention to details I had previously ignored. Grocery bags never appeared outside that apartment. There were never any deliveries, accumulated mail, or any signs of an ordinary daily routine. The windows stayed shut all the time, even on the occasional sunny days when the temperature rose slightly. One afternoon, I decided to work at the small table near my front door because the Wi-Fi signal was stronger there. I spent nearly 6 straight hours programming, getting up only to refill my coffee. During that entire time, no one opened the apartment across the hall. After dark, I took the trash to the communal dumpster and discreetly examined the lock on that apartment while I was outside. There were fresh marks around the doorknob as though it was used frequently, but the hallway was wrapped in complete silence. On my way back, while unlocking my own door, I suddenly had the unmistakable feeling that I was being watched. I instinctively looked toward the window of the apartment across from mine. The curtain was still closed, but for a split second, I noticed the slightest movement behind the fabric, as though someone had just stepped back a few inches to avoid being seen. I hurried inside, locked the door, and tried convincing myself that the isolation was beginning to make me imagine things. Even so, that night I left every light in my apartment on much longer than usual. The following night, the wind was incredibly strong. I could hear snow striking the windows and tree branches scraping across the roof of the building. After finishing work, I made something to eat and watched a game on television until around 10:30. The hallway remained completely silent, just as always. Then, without warning, the living room lights flickered twice before going out completely. The television shut off, the heating system stopped instantly, and the apartment was swallowed by an unsettling silence. The only light came from the moon reflecting off the snow outside. I grabbed my phone to use the flashlight but realized the battery was below 5% because I had spent the entire day using it as a second monitor for work. I decided to conserve what little power remained. I waited several minutes, assuming the electricity would come back on soon, but it never did. That's when I heard a faint creaking sound coming from the hallway. It sounded like a door opening very slowly. Since only 4 apartments were occupied, I assumed another tenant had stepped outside to see what was happening. I quietly walked to my front door and looked through the peephole. At first, I couldn't understand what I was seeing. The door of the apartment across the hall was open just enough to leave a narrow, dark gap between the door and the frame. The faint moonlight filtering through the hallway windows illuminated part of the interior, but almost everything remained hidden in shadow. It took me several seconds to realize that someone was standing inside. He was a tall man, completely motionless, hidden behind the partially opened door. He wasn't looking toward the hallway or the staircase. He was staring directly at my apartment through that narrow opening, as if he already knew exactly where my door was in the darkness. For a brief moment, I wondered if he was also looking through his peephole and we had simply happened to do the same thing at the same time. But then I noticed something that made my stomach turn. His position never changed at all. He remained perfectly rigid, one side of his face faintly illuminated without blinking, without resting a hand on the door, and without showing the slightest intention of stepping out. He simply seemed to be waiting. I continued watching for several more seconds, trying to decide whether I was overreacting. Then I heard a soft clicking sound somewhere in the hallway. The man slowly tilted his head, as if he had noticed a noise coming from my door. A moment later, without taking his eyes off my apartment, he began pushing the door farther open, making the hallway somehow feel even quieter than before. The moment the door opened a few more inches, my body froze. I kept staring through the peephole, unable to step away. The man took a single step out of the apartment and stopped. The faint hallway light revealed that he was wearing a thick, dark coat, winter boots, and ordinary blue jeans. There was nothing unusual about his clothing. What terrified me was his behavior. He never looked from side to side, didn't seem concerned about the power outage, and made none of the movements you would expect from someone trying to figure out what had happened. He simply remained facing my apartment door, completely motionless. I pulled my face away from the peephole for a second to catch my breath and considered calling the landlord. But then I realized my phone had shut off because the battery had died. When I looked again, he was still standing in exactly the same place. That's when I heard an incredibly faint sound coming from outside. It sounded like someone breathing near my front door. I couldn't tell whether it was actually coming from the hallway or if I was simply hearing my own breathing echoing because of my nerves, but it was enough to make me step backward. I grabbed a chair from the table and quietly wedged it beneath the doorknob. I knew it probably wouldn't stop anyone from getting in, but it made me feel like I was at least doing something. As I did that, I heard a dull sound from the hallway. It sounded like the weight of a winter boot slowly settling onto the carpet. Then another one, very slowly, as though someone were walking toward my apartment without the slightest hurry. I stood perfectly still, trying to listen more carefully. The footsteps stopped directly outside my apartment. My heart was pounding so hard it felt loud inside my chest. I spent almost an entire minute barely breathing. There was no knock at the door, no attempt to turn the doorknob, just that heavy silence on the other side. Finally, I gathered enough courage to look through the peephole again. At first, I couldn't see anyone. My relief lasted less than a second. The man was standing pressed against the wall beside my front door, outside the normal field of view of the peephole. I only noticed him because a small portion of his shoulder was visible at the very edge of the image. That meant he had walked all the way to my apartment and deliberately positioned himself where I wouldn't be able to see him. I continued watching without making a sound. After a few seconds, I slowly saw one of his hands reach toward my doorknob. He didn't turn it immediately. He simply held the metal for several moments, almost as if he were checking whether someone inside was listening. Then the doorknob slowly began to turn downward. I gripped the chair so tightly that my fingers started to hurt. The doorknob slowly turned all the way down and remained there for several seconds. Since I had locked the deadbolt as soon as I got home, the door didn't open. Even so, whoever was standing outside didn't immediately let go. Instead, they applied only the slightest pressure against the door, almost imperceptibly, as though trying to push it open without making any noise at all. That frightened me even more than if they had tried to kick the door down. It felt like someone testing whether I was awake or whether they could get inside without attracting attention. I remained completely motionless. After several seconds, the pressure stopped, and I heard 2 slow footsteps moving away down the hallway. I waited another full minute before finding the courage to look through the peephole again. The hallway was empty. The apartment across from mine was still standing open exactly as before. At that exact moment, the power returned. The hallway lights flickered back on all at once, flooding everything with light. Instinctively, I looked toward the apartment across the hall, expecting to see the man walking back inside, but no one was standing in the doorway. I kept watching for several more seconds until I noticed the door slowly beginning to close by itself, inch by inch, until it rested completely against the frame. I heard no footsteps, no lock turning, just the door quietly finishing its movement as though no one had been there at all. As soon as my phone powered back on a few minutes later after being connected to the charger, I called the police. 2 officers arrived about 20 minutes later and searched the hallway. They knocked on the apartment across from mine several times, but no one answered. Since there were no signs of forced entry or anyone calling for help, they explained they couldn't enter without authorization. The landlord arrived shortly afterward carrying a spare key. When he unlocked the door, all of us went inside. The apartment was completely dark and freezing cold. There was no food in the kitchen, no clothes lying around, and no television on. It looked as though no one had lived there for days. Even so, the bed was unmade and a chair had been placed beside the window, directly behind the curtain where I had seen that shadow every single night. The landlord looked genuinely confused and said the tenant always paid the rent on time through bank transfers, but admitted he hadn't personally seen him in months. The police documented everything, tried to locate the tenant using the contact information on file, but never found anyone. 2 days later, I ended my lease and returned to Denver. To this day, I still don't know who the man I saw that night was or why he seemed to spend so much time watching my apartment. What I have never been able to forget is the certainty that when the power went out, he wasn't simply staring at my front door. He was waiting for the moment he believed I would finally open it. Story 3. My name is Lauren Mitchell, and this happened to me in the spring of 2024 when I was 26 years old. I had just landed my first job as an English teacher at a high school in Athens, Ohio, a quiet college town. Up until then, I had been sharing a house with 2 other people, but I finally wanted to live on my own. After a few weeks of searching, I found a newly renovated apartment in a small 3-story building that had been built in the 1970s. The landlord showed me the apartment while it still smelled like fresh paint, with brand new flooring, replaced cabinets, and newly installed windows. It looked exactly like what I had been searching for. The rent fit my budget. It was less than 15 minutes from the school, and the neighborhood was quiet, occupied mostly by teachers, graduate students, and a few elderly residents. Since I spent the entire day at work and didn't get home until late afternoon, I wanted a place where I could relax without worrying about anything. During the first few days, everything seemed perfect. I organized my books, set up a small desk to prepare my lessons, and began settling into a normal routine. The only key I received was handed directly to me by the landlord, who mentioned that every lock in the apartment had been replaced during the renovation. That made me feel very secure because I assumed no one besides me would have access to the apartment. The first strange thing happened about a week after I moved in. I came home around 5:30 in the afternoon after spending the entire day grading exams and noticed that one of the kitchen chairs was pulled slightly away from the table. It wasn't much, maybe about 8 inches, but I was certain I always pushed it completely underneath the table before leaving. I figured I must have bumped into it that morning while rushing to work and simply forgotten about it. I set my bag on the couch, made myself a cup of coffee, and went on with my evening as usual. The following day, however, something else happened. Before leaving for school, I had left a bath towel hanging in the bathroom because it was still slightly damp. When I returned that afternoon, the towel was still damp, but it had been neatly folded over the towel rack as though someone had taken it down and placed it there only a short time earlier. I even checked to see if I had accidentally left a window open during the day, but they all appeared to be closed. I tried convincing myself that I was simply confusing my own routine because I'd only recently moved in. Even so, I began experiencing that uneasy feeling that's difficult to explain. When small details don't seem to make sense, yet you can't actually prove that anything happened. Over the next few days, I started paying much closer attention to everything before leaving for work. I made sure to leave the chairs in exactly the same position every morning, lined up the television remotes neatly on the coffee table, and even took pictures of the kitchen counter before locking the door. I knew it sounded excessive, but I needed to be certain I wasn't imagining things. For 2 days, nothing happened. Then on Thursday, I returned home shortly after 6 in the evening and found the living room window slightly ajar. It wasn't completely open, but it wasn't locked the way I always left it either. My first thought was that the wind might have moved it. I walked over to inspect it and realized the latch was still working perfectly. There were no signs of forced entry, no scratches on the frame, nothing unusual at all. As I locked the window again, I instinctively glanced toward the street and suddenly felt as though someone was watching me, even though no one was standing outside. That night, I reviewed every photo I had taken before leaving the apartment. The kitchen chair was exactly where it had been, and the living room looked unchanged. The only difference was the window, which was now unlocked. I slept poorly, waking up several times during the night just to make sure the front door was still locked. The following morning, I called the landlord and explained everything that had been happening. He listened patiently and replied that I was probably still adjusting to the new apartment. He reminded me that the windows were brand new, that the front door lock had been replaced during the renovation, and that there were no keys in circulation besides mine and the spare key kept in the management office for emergencies. His explanation sounded reasonable, but it didn't ease my concerns. I spent the rest of the day thinking about it while teaching my classes. On my way home, I stopped at an electronics store and bought a small Wi-Fi security camera that automatically recorded whenever it detected movement. It wasn't a professional system, just a simple model that could sit on top of a shelf. As soon as I got home, I discreetly placed the camera on a bookshelf in the living room, positioned so it covered the front door and part of the hallway inside the apartment. I ran several tests through the app on my phone to make sure the image was working properly, and before leaving again to pick up a pizza, confirmed that it started recording whenever someone came through the front door. Everything seemed to be working perfectly. For the first time since moving in, I felt that if something really was happening inside my apartment, I would finally have an answer. That evening, I only left to pick up the pizza I had ordered from a restaurant a few blocks away. I was gone for no more than 40 minutes. When I returned, the apartment looked exactly as I had left it. I ate dinner while watching television, prepared my lessons for the following day, and went to bed believing that maybe I really had been overreacting. The next morning, I woke up early, and while drinking my coffee, I remembered the security camera. I opened the app just to confirm that it had recorded me leaving and returning the previous night. The video began normally, showing me locking the door and walking downstairs. I skipped ahead a few minutes and was about to close the app when a motion notification appeared about 15 minutes after I had left. I assumed it was probably a sensor error, or maybe sunlight reflecting through the window. I tapped the clip and started watching. The front door remained perfectly still for several seconds. Then I clearly heard the sound of the lock being unlocked. The doorknob slowly turned, and the door opened as though someone were simply coming home. A man walked inside with complete confidence. He didn't force the door, didn't look around, and showed no sign of urgency. He simply closed the door behind him and slipped a key into the pocket of his jacket. My stomach instantly dropped. This wasn't an ordinary break-in. Whoever had entered possessed a genuine key to my apartment. I kept watching in disbelief. The man appeared to be in his early 50s. He was wearing a dark baseball cap, a brown jacket, and thin gloves. At no point did he try to hide his face from the camera. He walked straight into the kitchen, opened the cabinets, briefly looked over the countertop, and then moved into the living room. He wasn't rummaging through my belongings. He seemed to be observing. Next, he entered the bathroom. At that moment, I finally understood why the towel had been folded several days earlier. He picked it up, ran his hand across the fabric as though checking whether it was still damp, and carefully placed it back on the towel rack, but in a different position than before. After that, he walked into the bedroom, opened the wardrobe, looked inside for several seconds, and then came back out. He didn't take my money, my laptop, my television, or any valuable belongings. Before leaving the apartment, he quietly pushed the kitchen chair closer to the table, exactly the way someone would after finishing a meal. Then he unlocked the front door, calmly stepped into the hallway, and closed it behind him. He had remained inside my apartment for just over 8 minutes. By the time the video ended, my hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped my phone. I sat on the couch for several minutes staring at the screen, desperately trying to come up with an explanation that made sense. I wondered if maybe he was a maintenance employee checking for a leak or performing some scheduled inspection. But the more I replayed the footage, the less believable that explanation became. At no point was he carrying tools, a clipboard, or any kind of identification. Besides, if it had been an authorized visit, why would he enter while I wasn't home without notifying me? I immediately called the landlord and asked him to come to the apartment right away. When he arrived, I showed him the entire video without saying a word. His expression changed completely. I asked him how many keys existed for my apartment. He replied that there were only 2, mine and the spare key stored inside a locked cabinet in the management office. Together, we went there to check. The spare key was still hanging in its place, apparently untouched. Even so, I asked him to call the police. The officers watched the footage several times, and one of them pointed out a detail I hadn't even noticed. As soon as the man entered the apartment, he walked directly into the kitchen without hesitation, then headed straight to the bathroom and the bedroom, as though he already knew the exact layout of every room. It didn't seem like his first visit. Later that same day, the landlord authorized the immediate replacement of the lock, and the police collected the camera footage as evidence for their investigation. While the locksmith was dismantling the door, he found small wear marks inside the lock cylinder that, according to him, were consistent with a key that had been used repeatedly over a long period of time. A few days later, the building management discovered that the apartment had belonged to the building's former maintenance superintendent before the complete renovation. He had left his job several months before I moved in and had never returned all the duplicate keys he possessed while he was responsible for maintaining the units. The police tried to locate him, but he had already left town and was never found. I moved out less than a week later. To this day, I keep a security camera pointed at my front door everywhere I live. What unsettles me the most whenever I think back to that experience isn't the fact that a stranger entered my apartment. It's knowing that he wasn't looking for money, electronics, or jewelry. He simply walked through my rooms, observed my daily routine, touched my belongings, and quietly left, as though he only wanted to confirm that he could still come inside whenever he felt like it. Story 4. My name is Brian Foster. I'm 37 years old and I work as an accountant for a logistics company in Fort Collins, Colorado. This happened to me over a weekend in November 2024. My wife had traveled on Friday to spend 2 days with her parents in Kansas City, and I stayed home alone because I needed to finish several reports before the end of the month. We lived in a relatively new 5-story apartment building occupied mostly by couples and retirees. It was a quiet place where practically everyone knew each other, at least by sight. My plan was to take advantage of the peace and quiet to work, order food through a delivery app, and get some rest before picking her up from the airport on Sunday. I spent the entire Saturday at home. It had been raining since morning. It was very cold, and there was almost no activity on the street. Early that evening, I finished my last work files, watched a basketball game, and by around 11:30, I was getting ready for bed. Before turning off the lights, I checked that the front door was locked, closed the balcony door, and sent my wife a message telling her everything was fine. It was a completely ordinary night until shortly after midnight. I had been lying in bed for about 15 minutes when the building's fire alarm suddenly went off. The sound was incredibly loud, accompanied by the flashing red emergency lights in the hallway. My first thought was that someone had burned food or accidentally triggered a smoke detector. But then I heard doors opening and people running through the hallway. I threw a jacket over the clothes I was wearing, grabbed only my phone and my keys, and quickly left my apartment. As soon as I opened the door, I noticed a faint smell of smoke, although it was too weak to tell where it was coming from. Several neighbors were already heading down the emergency staircase, talking over one another as they tried to figure out what was happening. Since the elevator had automatically shut down, everyone used the stairs. I joined the flow of residents and started descending with them. We were around the third floor when I noticed something completely out of place. While dozens of people were hurrying downstairs, a man I had never seen before was walking up in the opposite direction. He was wearing a dark hoodie with the hood up, carrying a large backpack and moving without the slightest sense of urgency, calmly weaving past the people trying to get out of the building. At first I assumed he might be another resident going back upstairs to retrieve a pet or some important documents. Even so, something about his behavior made me uncomfortable. He seemed far more interested in reaching the upper floors than in escaping a possible fire. I kept walking downstairs, but I looked back more than once as the man passed us. What stood out to me most was that he didn't seem concerned about the alarm at all. Everyone else was moving quickly. Some were still in their pajamas. Others were carrying small children or holding dogs in their arms. Meanwhile, he maintained the same calm pace, gripping the strap of his backpack tightly and looking only at the steps ahead of him. At no point did he ask where the fire was or show any sense of urgency. As he walked past me, I caught a strong smell of cigarette smoke clinging to his clothes, completely different from the faint burning smell in the hallway. I thought about asking whether he lived in the building, but he walked by without even lifting his head. I continued downstairs until I reached the entrance, where dozens of residents had already gathered on the sidewalk. Some stared up at the windows trying to figure out which apartment the smoke was coming from, but no one could identify anything. A few minutes later, the fire department arrived and quickly entered the building. We waited outside for about 20 minutes. The entire time I kept thinking about that man walking upstairs while everyone else was doing exactly the opposite. I even looked for him among the people standing outside, but he never appeared. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. After a complete inspection, one of the firefighters informed us that there was no fire. The alarm had been triggered, but they hadn't found any fire, smoke source, or gas leak that justified the evacuation. They only said that the system appeared to have been activated from one of the hallways and that building management would conduct a more detailed inspection the following day. Little by little, the residents began returning to their apartments. I went back upstairs using the staircase alongside a few neighbors, still talking about how strange the whole situation had been. When I reached my floor, I immediately noticed that something was wrong with my front door. At first, I thought it was just the lighting playing tricks on me. But as I got closer, I saw several fresh scratches around the lock. The white paint had chipped away in multiple places, and there were deep gouges in the metal as though someone had tried forcing a tool into it. I touched the doorknob and felt an enormous sense of relief when the door opened normally. I walked through the apartment and checked every room. Nothing appeared to be missing and none of the windows were open. Even so, those marks definitely hadn't been there before I left. I locked that door every single day and would have noticed any damage. While I was still examining the lock from the inside, someone knocked on the neighboring apartment's door and announced that the police wanted to speak with everyone on the floor. I opened my door again and found 2 police officers talking with several neighbors in the hallway. One of them asked whether I had noticed anything unusual before the evacuation. I immediately showed him the scratches around my lock and explained that they hadn't been there when I left my apartment. While one officer photographed my door, the other went next door, where an elderly couple had also discovered similar marks around their doorknob. A few doors farther down, another resident reported finding the same kind of damage even though no one had managed to get inside. That completely changed the direction of the conversation. The officers began asking exactly when each resident had left the building and how long their apartments had remained empty. I told them about the man I had seen climbing the stairs with a backpack while everyone else was heading down. One of my neighbors immediately said he had also crossed paths with someone matching that description, but had assumed he was a firefighter because everything had happened so quickly. As we compared descriptions, it became obvious we were talking about the same person. The officers wrote down every detail and asked us not to discuss the incident on social media until they had finished reviewing the building's security camera footage. At that moment, I started realizing this probably hadn't been a coincidence at all. The following afternoon, a detective contacted me to supplement my statement. He explained that the security cameras showed a man entering the building only a few minutes before the alarm went off. He then disappeared from the monitored areas for several minutes and didn't reappear until he was leaving the building shortly after the firefighters arrived. The investigation indicated that the fire alarm had been deliberately triggered from an emergency control panel located in a service hallway. According to the detective, this type of scheme had already occurred in several other cities. Someone would activate a false fire alarm to force everyone out of their apartments and, during the confusion, quickly move through the building, trying to break into any units that had been left empty. The backpack was most likely used to carry tools and stolen valuables. Since the firefighters had arrived so quickly that night, the man apparently hadn't had enough time to enter any apartments and fled before residents were allowed back inside. My lock had to be replaced because its internal mechanism had been damaged during the attempted break-in. Ever since then, whenever a fire alarm goes off in any building where I am, I leave immediately, just as everyone should. But before I close my door behind me, I always take one last look down the hallway. After that night, I learned that in the middle of the rush to escape an emergency, there may also be someone taking advantage of that exact moment to look for an opportunity to enter your home. The following week, the building management called a meeting with all the residents to explain what had been discovered. They confirmed that they would strengthen the building's access control system, install more security cameras in the hallways, and replace the locks on every door that showed signs of attempted forced entry. During the meeting, another resident shared that he had left his laptop on the living room table before evacuating and found it in exactly the same place when he returned. But the chair had been moved, and one of the drawers was partially open. At the time, he had assumed he was imagining things, but after hearing everything else, he realized someone had most likely entered his apartment, heard the firefighters arriving, and been forced to leave before taking anything. The police believed the man quickly selected apartments that appeared to be empty and abandoned the attempt as soon as he encountered a stronger lock or heard movement in the hallway. They never identified the suspect, even though the security cameras captured part of his face as he entered the building. For several days afterward, I kept replaying the moment we passed each other on the staircase. If I had paid more attention or alerted someone immediately, maybe he would have been stopped before disappearing. At the same time, I know that in that situation, anyone would have assumed he was just another resident going upstairs to retrieve something. My wife returned on Sunday night and was just as shaken as I was when she saw the damaged lock. That same week, we installed a security camera facing our front door, reinforced the lock, and made an effort to get to know the neighbors on our floor better. Nothing like that ever happened in our building again. Even so, that night permanently changed the way I look at emergency situations in apartment buildings. I had always believed that a fire alarm existed only to get people out of a dangerous place as quickly as possible. It never crossed my mind that someone might deliberately trigger a false alarm simply to leave dozens of apartments empty at the same time. The man I encountered on the staircase wasn't running, didn't seem nervous, and didn't look lost. Today, I believe he was exactly where he wanted to be. While all of us were thinking only about getting out of the building safely, he was searching for the perfect opportunity to get into our homes. That's the part that still unsettles me whenever I think back to that night. Story 5. My name is Megan Brooks, and this happened to me in July of 2024 when I was 22 years old. At the time, I was studying architecture at the University of Washington and living alone in a rented apartment on the 10th floor of a modern building in Seattle. It was my first year living without roommates, and I really enjoyed the peace and quiet of the place. The building was relatively new, with large glass windows and small private balconies separated only by a narrow concrete divider between each apartment. Since that summer was hotter than usual for Seattle, I had gotten into the habit of leaving the balcony door open at night to let some fresh air in. There was no screen door, just the sliding glass door, and I never worried much about it because I lived on the 10th floor. In my mind, it was impossible for anyone to reach my apartment from the outside. That week I was finishing an important project for college, so I spent hours drawing and reviewing blueprints late into the night. My parents lived in Spokane, so I was usually completely alone during the week. My routine was simple: study, make something quick to eat, and go to bed sometime after midnight. That night I started studying shortly after dinner and completely lost track of time. It must have been around midnight when the apartment became perfectly quiet. The only constant sounds were the fan running beside my desk and the occasional cars passing far below on the avenue. The balcony door was open about 16 inches to let the air circulate. Suddenly, I heard two soft taps against the fixed glass panel beside the opening. They were so subtle that I immediately assumed a tree branch was being blown by the wind, even though I knew there weren't any trees that high up. I kept studying without paying much attention. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, there were 3 gentle taps, spaced a few seconds apart, as though something had carefully touched the glass. I glanced up for a moment, but the balcony was completely dark. The light from the living room reflected off the glass, making it difficult to see anything outside. I even walked a few steps toward the door, but I saw nothing except the distant lights of the city. I returned to my desk, convinced that the wind was probably moving something on the balcony. Even so, for the first time since moving into that apartment, I felt a strange urge to close the sliding door completely. I tried to focus on my project again, but the tapping kept returning at irregular intervals. Sometimes 5 minutes would pass before I heard it again. Other times there would be 2 short sequences only seconds apart. The strange thing was that the taps were never loud. They always sounded like something light gently touching the glass. I even put on headphones to finish a technical drawing, but I soon took them off because I realized I was paying more attention to the sounds outside than to my computer. I got up, walked out onto the balcony, and looked down. The street was almost empty, and a gentle breeze moved between the buildings. There wasn't nearly enough wind to explain those sounds. Before going back inside, I noticed something unusual on the small concrete divider separating my balcony from the neighboring one. There were several dark marks across the light-colored surface. I turned on my phone's flashlight and quickly shined it on the area. They were shoe prints. They weren't old, nor did they look like ordinary dirt washed there by the rain. Part of the rubber tread pattern was clearly visible, as though someone had recently stepped there. I stood there staring for several seconds, trying to understand how that could even be possible. The divider was only about 8 inches wide and ran along the outer edge of the 10th floor. No resident would ever step onto it for any normal reason. I looked toward the neighboring balcony, but the sliding glass door was closed. The lights were off, and there wasn't the slightest sign of movement. I went back inside and partially closed the balcony door, leaving only a small gap so the air could continue circulating. Even though I tried to act normally, I began feeling increasingly uneasy. I picked up my phone and sent a message to a friend from college asking if she was still awake, more because I wanted someone to talk to than because I actually needed anything. While waiting for her reply, I kept glancing toward the balcony every few minutes. The tapping had stopped completely. That should have reassured me, but instead, it had the opposite effect. The silence felt even stranger. I remembered the shoe prints and began wondering if perhaps a maintenance worker had crossed the balconies using safety equipment earlier that day. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. If any maintenance work had been taking place, the residents would have been notified. Besides, I had returned from campus late that afternoon and hadn't seen any trucks, scaffolding, or work crews outside the building. Shortly after 1 in the morning, I had an idea. I turned off every light in both the living room and the bedroom to eliminate the reflections on the glass. I stood completely still beside the wall for several seconds, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. Only then did I slowly walk toward the window and look out onto the balcony without getting too close to the glass. The moment my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could suddenly see far beyond the reflection in the window. At first, I saw only the outline of the divider separating the 2 balconies. Then I realized something was occupying part of that narrow space. It took me several seconds to understand what I was looking at. There was a person standing outside the building. A man, completely motionless, balanced on the narrow concrete ledge that ran in front of the balconies. He was standing between my apartment and the neighboring one, with one foot resting exactly on the divider where I had seen the shoe prints only minutes earlier. Since all the lights inside my apartment were off, he probably assumed I had already gone to bed. I couldn't make out his face clearly, only his dark silhouette against the city lights below. His body was facing my balcony, and one of his hands lightly gripped the building's exterior wall to maintain his balance. What frightened me the most was realizing that he didn't seem nervous. He wasn't trying to hide or looking for a way to escape. He was simply waiting. I remained perfectly still behind the living room wall, watching without making a sound. My heart was pounding so hard I was convinced he could hear it outside. After several seconds, the man took a small sideways step along the ledge, moving even closer to the opening of my balcony. At that moment, I became certain that if he believed the apartment was empty, or that I had already fallen asleep, he would try to cross over. I slowly backed away without taking my eyes off the balcony and grabbed my phone from the table. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 2 attempts just to unlock the screen. I immediately called 911 and spoke in an extremely quiet voice, terrified that any sound might attract his attention. I explained that there was a man standing outside my apartment, balanced on the edge of the 10th floor. The dispatcher asked a few quick questions and instructed me to stay away from the windows, lock the balcony door, and remain silent until the police arrived. I continued watching from a distance as I slowly walked toward the sliding glass door. The man remained in exactly the same position. When I finally reached the handle, I carefully slid the door shut as quietly as possible and locked it without making almost any noise. Even so, at that exact moment, the silhouette slowly raised its head toward the glass as though he had noticed movement inside the apartment. For several seconds, he stood completely still, staring directly toward the place where I was hiding. I stayed crouched behind the living room wall, gripping my phone so tightly that my fingers began to go numb. The dispatcher remained on the line the entire time, asking me to speak only if anything changed. I could still see the balcony by leaning my head slightly around the corner. The man was still outside, completely motionless. After several more seconds, he began moving again. With a calmness that seemed almost unbelievable, he placed one foot onto the floor of my balcony while keeping the other balanced on the narrow ledge outside the building. He moved slowly, like someone who was completely accustomed to maintaining his balance in that situation. Then he reached toward the outside handle of the sliding glass door and tried to pull it open. When he realized it was locked, he didn't force it or attempt to break the glass. He simply kept his hand on the handle for several moments, staring into the dark apartment. That reaction frightened me even more because it showed that he intended to enter quietly. If the door had still been open the way I left it every night, he would have needed only a single step to be standing inside my living room. A few seconds later, he released the handle and slowly stepped back onto the narrow divider, as though he didn't want to risk making any noise at all. Less than 5 minutes later, I heard sirens approaching along the avenue. The man noticed them too. As soon as the first red and blue lights reflected off the surrounding buildings, he glanced downward and began making his way back toward the neighboring balcony along the same narrow ledge. I watched in disbelief that someone could walk along that edge with such confidence. Within seconds, he disappeared behind the wall separating the apartments. A moment later, I heard several voices in the hallway and loud knocks on my front door. The police had arrived. I opened the door immediately and told them everything that had happened. While 2 officers stayed with me, the others searched the neighboring apartment and the building's rooftop. The apartment next door was empty. The owner had been traveling for nearly a week and gave the police permission to enter over the phone. They found no one inside. They also searched the roof, the emergency stairwells, and the maintenance areas, but the man had already disappeared. However, fresh shoe prints identical to the ones I had seen earlier were still visible on the divider between the 2 balconies, along with small loose fragments of concrete along the edges, as though someone had indeed walked across it many times. The following morning, the police returned to the building to review the security camera footage. One of the entrance cameras captured a man arriving shortly before 11 that night, wearing a baseball cap, a small backpack, and dark clothing. He entered immediately behind a resident who was returning with groceries without needing a key or access card. After that, he disappeared from the monitored areas. Since the cameras didn't cover the emergency stairwells or the balconies, it was impossible to determine exactly where he had gone. One of the officers commented that he had handled similar cases in other high-rise buildings involving people who took advantage of connected balconies or exterior ledges to observe apartments before attempting to enter, when they believed the residents were asleep or away. The building management decided to install cameras facing the exterior hallways and reinforce the doors leading to the stairwells. They also instructed all residents to keep their balcony doors locked at night, even during the hottest weather, Several neighbors admitted they had never imagined someone could attempt to reach another apartment from the outside of such a tall building. Neither had I. To me, living on the 10th floor had always seemed like natural protection against any attempted break-in. I stayed in that apartment for only 2 more weeks before managing to terminate my lease and move somewhere else. Ever since then, I still enjoy sleeping with plenty of fresh air in my apartment, but I've never again left a door or window open overnight. Whenever I enter a high-rise building now, I automatically look at the neighboring balconies and the distance between them. What has stayed with me the most wasn't the moment I saw that man balanced on the edge of the building. It was realizing that he wasn't trying to escape or improvising a path. He seemed to know exactly where to place every step, and was patiently waiting for me to return to my bedroom so he could believe the apartment was empty. If I hadn't turned off the lights to see where those tapping sounds were coming from, I probably would have left the balcony door open the way I did every night. And honestly, I still think about how that night might have ended if I hadn't realized someone was standing on my balcony until he was already inside my living room. Story 6. My name is Tyler Morgan, and this happened to me in early 2024 when I was 29 years old. I worked as a graphic designer for an agency in Portland, but I did everything remotely so I could practically live anywhere with a good internet connection. At the time, I rented an apartment in Tacoma, Washington, because the rent was much cheaper than in Seattle. The reason for the low rent became clear almost immediately. The entire building was undergoing a major renovation. Out of the 5 floors, only part of the 3rd floor remained occupied. I lived in the last apartment at the end of that hallway, while the other floors were officially closed for construction. The management said the workers only showed up during the day and that after 5 in the afternoon, the building was completely empty, except for the few tenants who hadn't yet ended their leases. To me, that sounded perfect. I had always liked having peace and quiet while I worked, and I figured the renovation wouldn't bother me much since I spent most of the day wearing headphones. My routine was simple. I worked until early evening, made something to eat, and usually stayed up late watching videos or playing games before going to bed. During the first few weeks, I really didn't have any problems. Throughout the day, it was common to hear drills, hammers, and construction workers talking on the upper floors. Around 6 in the evening, however, everything would stop completely. The building became so quiet that sometimes I could hear the elevator operating several floors below me. One Tuesday, close to 1 in the morning, while I was finishing a project for a client, I heard a heavy noise directly above my head. It sounded like a large piece of furniture being slowly dragged across the floor. At first, I assumed one of the workers had forgotten some tools and had come back later to retrieve them. I kept working without paying much attention. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, the sound was accompanied by heavy footsteps walking back and forth directly above my living room. They were slow, deliberate footsteps, very different from the ordinary noises of an old building. I stared at the ceiling for several seconds, trying to make sense of it. I knew the apartment directly above mine was part of the closed renovation area. The following day, while picking up a package at the management office, I casually mentioned the noises. The employee immediately replied that it was impossible. According to her, the entire 4th floor had been closed for more than 2 months with no tenants, no furniture, and absolutely no workers present during the night. Her answer should have settled the matter, but it did exactly the opposite. The following night, I tried not to think about it anymore. I spent the entire day working and even convinced myself that perhaps the sounds had come from another apartment and simply traveled through the building's structure. After dinner, I watched a movie and went to bed shortly before midnight. About an hour later, I woke up to the same noise. This time, it didn't sound like furniture being dragged. It was a series of slow footsteps crossing the ceiling above my bedroom from one side to the other. I stayed in bed, listening carefully to the rhythm. The footsteps would reach one end of the apartment, stop for several seconds, and then return along the exact same path. It repeated over and over. I grabbed my phone to record the audio, but the sounds were too faint for the microphone to capture properly. Even so, I could hear them clearly. I got out of bed and stood in the middle of the living room. The footsteps continued above me. Then came 2 long scraping sounds as though someone were dragging a heavy object across a concrete floor. I waited for the noises to stop, but they continued for nearly 15 minutes. When everything finally went quiet, I looked out my apartment window out of habit. The fourth floor was directly above me, completely dark. No lights were on, there was no movement, and there wasn't even a shadow visible through the windows. The following morning, I went back to the management office, this time much more insistently. The building manager accompanied me to the elevator, and together we went up to the fourth floor. As soon as the elevator doors opened, I found a hallway covered with construction plastic, a strong smell of fresh paint, and several signs indicating that the area was closed for renovation. The apartment doors were sealed with caution tape and small security tags placed there by the construction company. The manager showed me everything and assured me that no one was authorized to remain there during the night. He even mentioned that the electricity on that floor had been temporarily shut off to make the electrical work easier. It all seemed to remove any remaining doubt. I apologized for insisting and went back downstairs, convinced that perhaps the noises had come from the roof or from the building's metal structure, contracting during the cool night. But that very same night, shortly after 2 a.m, the footsteps returned. This time they were even clearer. They walked directly above my living room, followed by another heavy scraping sound. I sat on the couch listening for several minutes. Then, without warning, the noises stopped abruptly. A second later, I heard something different. 3 sharp knocks came from the ceiling, evenly spaced, as though someone had deliberately knocked on the floor of the apartment above me. Those 3 knocks were enough to destroy any remaining attempt to find a logical explanation. I sat there staring at the ceiling for several seconds, waiting for the sound to happen again. Nothing. I grabbed a flashlight, put on a jacket, and decided to go up to the 4th floor. I briefly considered calling the management office, but it was almost 2:30 in the morning, and I knew no one would answer. The elevator had been programmed not to stop on that floor during the renovation, so I used the emergency staircase instead. When I reached the 4th floor, I found the hallway completely dark. The smell of fresh paint was still strong, and a thick layer of dust covered the floor. I slowly walked down the hallway, illuminating the apartment doors with my flashlight. Almost all of them were still sealed with their caution tape completely intact, but when I reached the apartment directly above mine, I immediately noticed something different. The caution tape had been torn on one side and the door wasn't completely closed. There was a gap of only a few inches between the door and the frame. I stopped without making a sound and listened carefully. I heard no footsteps, no voices, and no other movement. I gently pushed the door just enough to look inside. The first thing I saw was my flashlight reflecting off a completely empty floor. There was no furniture, no cabinets, and no obvious sign that renovation work was taking place. Even so, there was something inside that apartment that absolutely should not have been there. I stepped inside only 2 or 3 paces, leaving the door partially open behind me. In the corner of the living room was a thin mattress leaning against the wall, covered with a dark blanket that was still messy, as though someone had just gotten up from it. Beside it were 2 partially full water bottles, several ready-to-eat meal containers, a flashlight, a portable charger, and an open backpack filled with neatly folded clothes. On the floor sat a closed pizza box, and when I walked closer, I realized it was still slightly warm. That meant someone had been there only a short time earlier. My heart immediately began racing. I shined my flashlight through the rest of the apartment and walked toward the living room window, which was completely open despite the cold night air. When I looked outside, a chill ran down my spine. From that window, I had a perfect view directly into my own apartment. I could clearly see my work desk, my couch, my television, and even part of my bedroom through the windows. The position of that apartment provided a direct view of my daily routine. While I was still trying to process what I was seeing, I heard a sharp click coming from the hallway, directly outside the door I had just entered through. I froze where I stood. Instinctively, I switched off my flashlight and remained perfectly still, trying to listen more carefully. The apartment became almost completely dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the streetlights coming through the open window. The click was followed by a faint creak, as though someone had just shifted their weight onto the hallway floor. I held my breath and stared toward the doorway. A few seconds later, I heard slow footsteps approaching. Not many. 2 or 3 steps, then silence. My first thought was that it might be a security guard or one of the construction workers making a routine inspection. But I dismissed that idea almost immediately. If it had been an employee, they probably would have called out as soon as they realized someone was inside a restricted apartment. Instead, whoever was standing outside remained completely silent. It felt as though they were listening too, trying to figure out exactly where I was. I stayed hidden behind the living room wall without making the slightest sound. Then I saw the doorknob slowly move. It turned only a few millimeters before returning to its original position. A moment later, the door began opening very slowly. The gap widened only a few inches. Standing in the doorway was nothing more than the dark silhouette of a man in the hallway. He didn't immediately step inside. He simply stood there looking into the apartment, as though he knew someone was inside but couldn't tell exactly where. My instinct was to run, but the only exit was the doorway where he was standing. I remained frozen for several more seconds until I heard the sound of a truck radio drifting up from the avenue below. Taking advantage of that brief noise, I quietly walked toward the open window and looked at the exterior metal fire escape attached to the side of the building. It was less than 3 feet away from the window. Without giving it much thought, I swung one leg outside, grabbed the railing tightly, and managed to reach the fire escape platform. The metal was freezing cold and slippery from the damp night air. The moment I placed my second foot outside, I heard the apartment door open completely behind me. I never looked back. I climbed down as quickly as I could to the 3rd floor and re-entered the building through another emergency exit. I ran straight to my apartment, locked everything, and called 911. While waiting for the police to arrive, I kept watching the windows on the 4th floor. About 2 minutes later, I saw a silhouette briefly appear at the window of the restricted apartment. The person stood there for only a moment, staring directly toward my apartment before disappearing just before the first police cars pulled into the building's parking lot. The police arrived only a few minutes later and carried out a complete search of the 4th floor, alongside a representative from the building management. I accompanied them only after they confirmed the hallway was secure. When we returned to the restricted apartment, the mattress, backpack, water bottles, and food containers were exactly where I had seen them. There was also a small notebook containing handwritten time entries. Most were simple notations like 7:15, 1840, and 23:10, followed by short observations. One of the officers realized that many of those times matched moments when I usually left my apartment to collect my mail, take out the trash, or turn off my lights at night. Near the window, they found a cheap pair of binoculars resting on the floor and a folding chair positioned directly in front of the view into my apartment. The police collected everything for forensic examination. Meanwhile, another officer inspected the exterior fire escape and discovered fresh mud and rubber marks on the metal steps, indicating that someone had indeed used it to escape only minutes before the police arrived. The building manager was visibly shaken. According to him, no one had imagined that one of the restricted apartments was being used as a hiding place during the renovation. The apartment locks on that floor were old, and some doors had to remain only partially closed during the construction work, making it easy for someone to slip inside without attracting attention. The following day, I terminated my lease and temporarily moved into a friend's house in Tacoma until I could find another apartment. A few weeks later, a detective contacted me to inform me that they had never identified the man who had been secretly living on the 4th floor. The fingerprints recovered from the apartment weren't registered in any database, and the exterior security cameras showed only a person entering and leaving the building through different entrances, always wearing a baseball cap and loose-fitting clothing. The case was ultimately classified as trespassing and attempted residential burglary, but no one was ever arrested. What I have never been able to forget is realizing that for weeks, someone had been spending every night in an empty apartment watching my routine through the window. The noises I heard above my head weren't caused by the renovation, the building's structure, or my imagination. They were simply the sounds of a person secretly living directly above me. Ever since then, whenever I move into a new place, I make a point of getting familiar with the surrounding apartments and checking whether supposedly vacant units are actually empty. Because after that experience, I learned that just because an apartment is officially unoccupied doesn't mean nobody is living there.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.